He was once the embodiment of majesty, a towering monarch, a Renaissance icon, the very face of divine rule in England. But now, Henry VIII lay slumped in his bed, swollen and festering, a shell of his former self. The smell of rot clung to the velvet hangings like a warning. His breath came in shallow gasps, thick with phlegm and the sour scent of decay. Servants moved quietly, keeping their distance, eyes averted, not out of reverence, but fear. No one dared speak of the obvious. The king was dying, and it wasn't noble, it wasn't silent, it was grotesque. How does a man go from lion to carcass? How does a king, once able to summon armies and dissolve entire religions with a glance, end up needing a pulley just to sit upright? His body betrayed him with merciless precision. Legs so bloated they oozed pus, ulcers that refused to close, and pain so consuming that morphine-like remedies barely touched it. He lashed out, even as he begged for comfort. His once sharp mind wandered, haunted by specters of wives beheaded and friends betrayed. Was it guilt, madness, or was the kingdom itself rotting through its monarch? And yet, no one stopped him. The courtiers bowed lower, the physicians lied more convincingly, the clergy prayed louder. No one told the king he was finished, because to admit Henry was dying was to risk their own ruin. So they played the game, dressing the wound, sweetening the air, pretending that the sovereign still ruled with clarity and command. But deep down, everyone knew. They saw it in his eyes, dull and yellowing, in the way his mouth twitched with pain, in the groans that filled the long candlelit nights. This wasn't just the death of a man, it was the collapse of a myth, a reminder that even gods dressed in gold eventually fall apart like anyone else. There's something quietly terrifying about watching power dissolve, not in battle or betrayal, but slowly, day by day, in the silence of a darkened chamber. And that's what made it horrific. Not just the physical ruin, but the refusal to speak its name. He wasn't always a monster. Once, Henry VIII was dazzling, tall, broad-shouldered, a golden prince in the eyes of his people. At just 17, he inherited the throne, and with it, the hopes of an entire kingdom. He was the image of the Renaissance ideal, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in music and theology, and deadly on horseback. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about his charisma. Women swooned. Even his enemies respected him. To witness young Henry was to believe in the possibility of greatness, of strength guided by reason, of royalty graced with beauty. England adored him, and for a moment it felt earned. But time, as always, has no loyalty. The handsome prince aged into something unrecognizable. The glint in his eye gave way to a heavy, suspicious glare. His once athletic frame swelled to over 400 pounds. His legs, torn apart by jousting injuries, refused to heal, becoming breeding ground for necrosis. The stench of his ulcers filled rooms before he entered them. Some days he couldn't even walk. Iron braces wrapped around his legs. A custom-built lift was used to hoist him from his bed like broken cargo. He'd gone from commanding legions to being lowered like luggage. And here's the part no one likes to admit. It didn't happen overnight. It was slow. It crept in like rot beneath gilded floorboards. One indulgent meal, one untreated wound, one betrayal too many. The man who once represented human potential became a warning about power, about pride, about time itself. He had everything, and still he decayed. Isn't that what frightens us most? That no matter how admired, how powerful, how loved, we all inch toward collapse. The transformation of Henry VIII isn't just a royal tragedy, it's personal, it's a mirror. It reminds us that decline doesn't always begin with thunder. Sometimes it begins with applause and ends in silence, swollen limbs, and a body too broken to bear its own weight. By the end, the royal bedchamber might as well have been a torture chamber. It reeked of blood and rot, thick with the stifling scent of old linen soaked in pus. The king's moans pierced the night, not with the majesty of a dying lion, but with the raw agony of a man at war with his own body. His leg ulcers, deep, blackened wounds that never healed, split open daily. Physicians cacked them with herbs and linen, but the stench still clung to every curtain, every robe, every servant who dared get close. They dosed him with opium until his speech slurred and his eyes rolled back, but even drugged, he couldn't escape the horror. Some nights, he cried out for Jane. Other nights, he whispered Anne's name with a tone too soft to be rage, too broken to be love. His mind, once sharp enough to dismantle Rome's authority in England, now unraveled in silence and fever. Did he see their faces? The wives he'd executed, the friends he'd ordered to the block. Ghosts no one else could see visited him in the flickering candlelight. Was it guilt, madness, or was the kingdom itself rotting through its monarch? But even as his mind rotted, his temper remained lethal. Courtiers learned to speak in half sentences, to bow with their eyes downcast, to offer nothing but praise, even when he screamed, even when he flung silver goblets or threatened execution for perceived slights. No one could predict the trigger, a mispronounced word, a glance too long, a pause before answering. Servants were terrified of their proximity to power, a power now fused with madness and decaying before their eyes. And here lies the most twisted irony. The very body Henry once flaunted, parading through jousts, posing for portraits, seducing courtiers, was now his prison. Every breath brought pain. Every waking hour was a fight against infection, against delusion, against the mirror. It wasn't a fall from grace, it was a slow-motion implosion, grotesque, humiliating, and unstoppable. What do you do when the king becomes the curse? When the most dangerous man in England is also the most broken? Everyone walked on eggshells, but deep down, they were just waiting for the body to finally give in. Behind the velvet curtains of Henry's deathbed, another war raged, quieter, bloodless for now, but no less ruthless. The king's body was barely holding together, but the kingdom it anchored still hung in the balance. Everyone knew the rules of succession were clear on parchment and meaningless in practice. Power was up for grabs. And with every groan from Henry's chamber, with every whisper that he might not last the night, the scramble intensified. The Duke of Norfolk watched from the shadows, old and sly, his ambitions masked in ceremony. Edward Seymour, brother to Henry's beloved Jane and uncle to the boy heir, began building alliances in silence. Thomas Cranmer, the king's spiritual guide, offered blessings with one hand and political maneuverings with the other. They all knew whoever controlled Edward VI, the frail 9-year-old prince, would control England. But time was cruelly tight. Henry's signature was now barely legible, his hand shook, his mind slipped. But even so, he signed arrest warrants, sealed fates, and shifted power with a flick of the wrist. One day he was lucid, the next he wept at ghosts. And what if he died too soon? France watched hungrily from across the channel, Scotland stirred, Spain waited, calculating. Civil war was not unthinkable. The realm could splinter before the boy ever touched the throne. So plans were whispered at midnight, guards were bribed, wills were rewritten, then rewritten again. One signature here, one omission there. Suddenly, a rival was declared a traitor, or a loyalist found himself holding the keys to the treasury. No one knew exactly when Henry would die, but they all prepared as if it might be in the next breath. Friendships cracked, family members spied on one another. Even the most loyal courtiers rehearsed which side they'd take, if and when the sword fell. And still, they bowed, they smiled, they brought him wine, called him majesty, all while calculating the angle of their knives. The king had not yet died, but in the corridors of power, the vultures were already circling. Because in Tudor England, the throne never stayed warm for long, and whoever sat on it next would define the fate of empires. The final hours of Henry VIII unfolded not in defiance, but in flickering doubt. The man who had torn England from the Pope's grip, who had built a throne out of broken monasteries and severed heads, now whispered half-remembered prayers into his sweat-soaked pillow. His once thunderous voice reduced to gravel and groans, Henry hovered between two faiths, Protestant reform and Catholic ritual, as if unsure which side might offer mercy. The room was dark, save for the trembling candlelight that threw monstrous shadows across the walls. Courtiers dared not speak. Only Thomas Cranmer remained close, watching the king's mouth move with barely formed words. Sometimes it was Latin, other times fractured English. A bishop had been summoned, then dismissed, then summoned again. No one knew what rights the king wanted, perhaps not even Henry himself. He murmured names in his delirium, some familiar, some long buried. Anne, More, Jane, Cromwell. Did he see them? Did they wait for him? In these fragile hours, the ghosts came freely, not to haunt, but to ask questions he could no longer answer. Did you do it for God or yourself? Was it justice or fear? At one point, Cranmer leaned close, his voice calm, almost paternal. If you put your trust in Christ, squeeze my hand. The silence that followed stretched unbearably, until, at last, the king's fingers twitched around Cranmer's. It was weak, barely there, but it was something. Henry could no longer move. His limbs were stone, his breath shallow. His body, bloated and broken, now betrayed the soul that once imagined itself ordained by God. Outside, England waited, not for another war or a new edict, but for the inevitable, a moment that would outlive them all. As dawn neared, the room thickened with finality. Not rage, not glory, just the slow, ancient end of a man. A king, yes, but now only a soul preparing to stand where no crown could follow. Death finally claimed Henry VIII, but his body wasn't finished. The corpse was enormous, bloated, foul, and restless. Courtiers worked quickly to embalm him, but even the finest Tudor preparations couldn't contain what lay beneath. The gases had already begun to build, thick and deadly. Wrapped in silk and laid inside a grand coffin fit for a monarch, Henry's body was moved with care and dread.
But by the time the royal procession reached Sion Abbey, the damage had already begun. The temperature rose, the box swelled, then cracked. A burst of rot split through the wood. The king's remains, too powerful to be contained even in death, spilled out. Black fluid seeped from the coffin and pooled onto the chapel floor. It smelled of sickness and old wine, and something far worse. Those nearby retched. Servants looked away. Then came the dogs. Stray animals had slipped into the chapel during the night. Drawn by the scent, they licked at the royal discharge, lapped it up off sacred stone, turning the king's final resting place into something grotesque, almost mythic. Observers would later recall a prophecy, that dogs would lick Henry's blood. They whispered it with awe. Or was it fear? This, after all, was the man who declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, whose words shattered centuries of tradition, whose touch signed death warrants with cold precision. And yet, this was how it ended. Not in glory, not in reverence, but with the slow, sticky undoing of flesh. No triumph, no silence, just leaking wood and the stench of reality. The mighty Lion of England, once wrapped in gold and gospel, now left behind a puddle and a prophecy, a leaking coffin, a chapel of shame, and the undeniable truth that even a king, perhaps especially a king, cannot escape decay. His body was buried, but his shadow remained, bloated, seeping, inescapable. England did not breathe easily after Henry's death. Instead, the air grew heavier, as if the very land had inhaled him and now couldn't let him go. Whispers of his ghost circulated like wildfire. Monks in shuttered abbeys claimed to hear him stomping through the halls at night, the dragging of a twisted leg echoing down stone corridors. Commoners dreamed of his face, swollen, purple, grinning with rot. In some villages, livestock sickened, crops failed. The devout said it was his ulcers, oozing into the soul of the nation, poisoning what he'd once ruled. Preachers found sermons in his sores. They said his monstrous body was a mirror, God's judgment carved into flesh. That England itself had festered through schism and blood, and Henry had simply become its symptom. He was no longer a king in memory. He was a warning, a wound that would not close. And what were they to make of his contradictions? Protestants called him their flawed Moses, dragging the country from Rome but never reaching the promised land. Catholics mourn him as a tyrant turned tragic, a man who died muttering of saints and ghosts, too proud to return, too damned to lead. Each side claimed him, then recoiled. He had become myth, rotting, terrifying myth. For years after, England remained on edge. It wasn't just the politics. It was something deeper, existential. The fear that if a king, the king, could die screaming, bloated, haunted, then what chance did the rest of them have? The torch had passed to young Edward VI, but the kingdom was still wrapped in shadow. Henry's rule had ended, but his legacy would linger, tangled in fear, faith, and flesh. Death had taken the man, but England still lived under the weight of the corpse. He ruled by fear, by fire, by absolute command. He had reshaped a nation around his whims, decapitated friends, exiled queens, ripped his country from the Pope's grasp, and called it all divine right. For nearly 40 decades, Henry VIII had been the sun in England's sky, blazing, dangerous, inescapable. But now the fire had gone out, and what remained was ash. In theory, his legacy should have been unshakable. The bureaucratic machine he'd built, centralized, relentless, efficient, continued to grind forward. Ministers still filed his edicts. Courtiers still bowed to his laws. His reforms, his wars, his children, all written into the fabric of England. But the man himself, his will, his towering, furious presence, vanished the moment the breath left his lips. There was no lingering command, no enduring influence of the flesh. His voice, once silenced, his empire began to drift. His funeral, of course, was immense. Trumpets, banners, sermons echoing across cold stone. Bishops prayed for a soul they feared had slipped too far into torment. Nobles knelt before a casket that had already betrayed its contents. They carried him to St. George's Chapel with every ounce of ceremony they could muster, as if ritual could outshine rot. Yet beneath it all lay a final irony. The tomb, the grand, golden resting place he had designed for himself, was never finished. He had commissioned it during his lifetime, as kings do, envisioning a monument to match his ego. But politics shifted, priorities changed, and eventually the plans were shelved. His body lies there still, in Windsor, in a vault meant to be temporary. A monarch who ruled as if he would never die, yet who lies in an unfinished grave. So did he win? Or did death, in its quiet, indifferent way, humiliate him? This was the man who had commanded the elements of church and state, and yet in the end, nothing, no force, no fear, no divine right, could stop the truth. The skin breaks, the blood clots, the name fades. Power is not permanence. It never was. He left behind 3 children, yes, each one a ruler in their own right. But each one carried more than just the crown. They carried the burden, the fracture, the curse of a king who thought he could control history, only to become its darkest chapter.